Hey everyone, welcome back to a new video. I hope you had a great day. Let's take a look at some new malicious compliance stories, shall we? The first story is called Why I Quit Aerospace. The first real job I had when I left college was for an aerospace company that is fairly well known for its commercial airplanes. I managed to learn fast and then streamline a lot of the processes that were holdovers from what most of my coworkers called the lazy bee down the road. One of those processes that saved an enormous amount of money was to move away from print copies to PDF reviews. The company went through reams upon reams of big printing paper every day, and we had the laser printer and copier guys out every week. By just implementing my process, I saved the company around $5,000 in the first month alone. And more every month after that, as more of the engineering review and document processing moved to PDF. About 2 years into this, my boss's boss hired a guy out of Kansas who epitomized the term fake laconic. He had bounced from shop to shop and came to us because his friend had become a manager at our company. This friend was one of the few engineering leads who refused to implement the new secured PDF review system. By this time, I had already gotten several salary promotions and was over a team of 5 other people managing their work and submitting it to my boss. I actually spent less time doing the work that I was originally hired to do and more time looking at how to automate a lot of our processes. One of those was teaching everyone to hit F7 and spend 5 minutes with a spell checker. I set up a script that did the same thing with every document submitted, so that we didn't have to pay the FAA guys to reject our stuff based on stupid punctuation and spelling mistakes. Technically speaking, Kansas Boy was going to be an editor, which meant I needed to work with him in the submission process and get his input on the best way to integrate ISO review for specialty lines of business into our system. This did not go well. In the first meeting I had with him, it took him over a minute to finish a sentence that, when I counted, was less than 50 words total, not including redundant words. In the second meeting, I had him saying to me, "Man, you gotta slow down, you work yourself right out of a job." It did not help my perception of his being stuck in the 80s that he wore his hair in a modified mullet and wore a mustache. And that he made inappropriate comments multiple times about our boss, who was a single mom with 3 kids. Things eventually came to a head between us when he was given just enough approval power to demand that he receive print copies of the documents before he would review them. At that point, he had bogged the review process down so much that he had bottlenecked 4 projects with the intention of taking people away from my team to train properly as editors. He would work extra hours and then take work home, which, as far as I could tell, meant he would take it home and leave it on his table while he watched the football game. Since he was on an hourly wage, it also meant anything we had to have him review blew up in project hours by double the estimate. And because you had to be signed into the system to review work on my PDF system, and it tracked connection and access time, as well as when a modification was made to the document, he really didn't like using it. As for me, I was salaried and perfectly happy that way. But I ran up against this clown taking hours and days to review things that could have been done in minutes if he just learned how to press 3 buttons, and he would refuse to do it. Eventually, I went to the director of engineering and explained what was happening. This resulted in a conversation with this guy's friend. He went out of his way to insist that the PDF review process wasn't secure. It was. That it was inefficient. It wasn't. And that the best way to do things was the way Kansas Boy liked to do them. Months went by and the project balked, mostly because of Kansas Boy's review process. Finally, it was down to the last week of submission, and my team had done everything they needed to do per our submission process. The director called me in on Monday. He informed me that because this engineering lead was connected to the new project, he had the final say over how the documentation and instruction for install were going to be handled, and that my team and I should support their team to the best of my ability. Then he invited me to play golf with him that weekend. I don't play golf. I have never played golf. I can play mini golf with some drinks, but the last time I played golf, I had a caddy with a golf ball on the previous hole. Twice. Nobody knows how. The point is that inviting me to play golf is like asking a basketball player to play professional llama polo. You don't do it unless there's another reason that doesn't involve watching very tall men avoid getting bitten by irritated camelids and laughing. Then I got a memo, written on actual paper in a time of email from Kansas Boy about a meeting to discuss the submission issues. By lunch, I had had 4 hours of meetings with Kansas and his lead, Douche, who were laying out very smugly their requirements for how they were submitting all their documents. Having been given carte blanche to run this project to completion, they sat there and dictated exactly how it was all going to go down. All of the documents were due by Friday afternoon, over 700,000 pages of reports, assessments, drawings, installation manuals, etc. For personal review of every page by Kansas boy and his paid intern. It was impressed upon me that this project was under the eye of the president of the company itself, and they insisted they all be printed out, completely on paper. These arrogant schmucks were all but picking nuts out of their grins at the end of the meeting. I should mention that at this point there were so few printers used in the company that the massive copier and printer in the file archive was the only one really capable of handling the load. Everything else was the standard small office laser printer setup with less than 3 reams of paper usable. To wit, the amount of printing they wanted to do would take about the full capacity of the whole company's printing capacity. And since my purview at that point included the production of documentation, it technically fell into my lap to make it happen. They also told me that if I managed to complete it by Friday, the company would get a bonus from our client. They said this was incredibly important, as this was a client we wanted to impress to get more business from them in the future. The truth was that our company's profit-sharing incentives would reward the people who made it happen at the end of the year. Meaning that the two of them would get bonuses for being the face of this particular project, while everyone who actually made it happen would get a $5 Starbucks gift card. Tuesday, I had pulled all 10 of my team members of their projects and we tasked them to printing everything. We commandeered every single printer in the building, including the president's personal laser printer and the photocopier his secretary used. I had them working overtime for hours a night with pizza and beer, with stacks of toner, reams of paper, and repurposed the biggest conference room with laptops and printers. I parked myself in the file archives with the big beast to run the majority of the work. At the end of the week, we had more angry complaints, ranging from the conference room being occupied by our operation to lack of printing supplies and staples and overloaded printing queues for almost everything. At one point, the FAA guy who was in charge of the project stepped in and demanded to know when he could print out his files, which were needed to actually submit all this. We made it happen on Thursday night with 3 hours to spare before the deadline of Friday morning. We delivered the whole thing to Kansas boy's 6 foot by 6 foot cubicle, our 700,000 pages of it in boxes and boxes of paper. Stacked precisely in his cube so as to prevent any blocking of the emergency egress as per our ISO 9000 and safety protocols. And we provided an electronic copy of everything we would submit normally to the FAA guy whose responsibility it was to review everything before submission. I want to be clear, while we did block Kansas boy's desk almost completely, this was not the malicious part. When I came into the job, one of the new hires in my orientation class had a tradition of taking a tiny vector line art drawing figure of his alma mater's mascot and adding it to every single file. It was never significant enough to be seen even on a full plot of an engineering drawing, but that was his running joke for every single drawing he worked on. The Engineering State University that was the rival to his school also had a few engineers that worked at our company, and they began putting their mascot and vector line art into their drawings. Then, someone who had a different sense of humor made one from a popular animated cartoon of the 1980s. This one, at a certain size, looked absolutely nothing like a robot that turned into a jet plane and more like a very small standard metric. And he made it available in the library of standard parts as a do not use this model part for a drawing template. None of these things are kosher to include on an official engineering specification, even in drawing form, even if the plotter at maximum size cannot determine if it's a school mascot or a maple leaf or a goofy robot toy from the 1980s. The only reason that the company got away with it was that nobody was stupid enough to resize all of the CAD components to show exactly what every single part was supposed to look like. Once I realized what would happen if it ever came out or the models made it through to submission, I had the engineers who did this as a game go through their old drawings and take their little mascots out. And I asked them to pass it on to anyone who did the same. Being able to search the engineering database by part number meant I could also flag those drawings for editing and have the people responsible for them take them out. Unfortunately, nobody knew that Douche had included his own little vector art thing, which was a maple leaf with a woman wielding a hockey stick in front of her. It never made it into the primary database of templates, but Douche refused to use the standard templates because they weren't up to his standard. We did not know that he had left it on every single one of the templates he demanded his team use. He was still one of the holdouts who refused to use the system to check drawings in and out of the main database until he had approved them for his team. He did, however, check them into the database of approved drawings once they had been submitted to both the client and the FAA, so the copies of the most recent files were on record. But as far as participating in the rest of it, nope. His excuse was that his team worked better that way. And yet that meant, of course, that any given part that he'd choose a specific ID number for would often conflict with other part numbers in the database. This would then result in a meeting to iron out the fact that he was ignoring the convention everyone else used. To add insult to injury and irritation for his team members, he also placed his name on almost every single one, regardless of who had done the drawing. This meant that anyone who needed information about the project had to go through him instead of checking with the person who built the model in the first place. The douche had more turnover in his team than anywhere else in the company for multiple reasons. But the fact that he would routinely take credit for engineering drawings he didn't do at a company that tended to use how many you did as a metric for your job performance was a huge one. His insistence on making extra work that didn't actually help the client was another. And his general bad attitude towards anyone who told him no was another, especially those who used it when he told them they had to work through the weekend because his team was behind again on their projects. This big huge project was no exception to his make work idiocy. As part of the submission for this particular project, Douche had demanded to have a full catalog of every single modeled part and component printed up and submitted. He wanted the client, who hadn't asked for it, to be able to determine which part they needed. His rationale was that because we were the source supplier for 60% of the parts included, we could make sure they knew we were the only ones they could buy them from. And the one thing the douche had decided to actually allow to be automated in this process? A script that expanded every single component on the engineering drawing to full size and submitted it as part of the official engineering parts list. You might see where this is going. I had taken Friday off, but on Monday morning I got a call from the VP's personal assistant to come into the office for an important meeting. On Friday afternoon I walked into the conference room next to my director's office. My director had the most poker face expression I have ever seen on his face when he opened the door and let me in to one of the loudest arguments I have ever walked in on before or since. The FAA rep, the president of the company, the vice president over our department, Kansas Boy and Douche were all sitting around the table. The FAA rep, a generally fairly genial, round-bellied man, was yelling at Douche and Kansas Boy at the top of his lungs about how serious this matter was and how ridiculous they would make the company look. And that if he submitted this garbage, the fact that he let it through would at the very least require a full review of every single document he had approved while working with our company. When there was a pause in the barrage, my director asked me if I knew if there were any non-standard drawings or cartoons in our engineering database of CAD files. I said, well yeah, those are the template example parts that are removed automatically from the template when someone copies it to their local drive. They are just there as examples. They are labeled that way too. Nobody actually keeps those, and they can't. They are deleted from the drawing immediately when someone saves a local copy of the template. And that's when the VP, a woman in her mid-40s, brought in to change the heavy bro culture of our company, said, "You actually keep this as an example in your template database?" She held up a full ream's worth of blown up version of the art the douche used, framed beautifully in an engineering 3D isometric part view. My jaw dropped open, and I think I made some odd noises that could have been mistaken for strangled laughter. Kansas Boy and Douche tell us you're responsible for maintaining the full engineering part database system. So if the buck stops with you, this is on you to explain to everyone here what this is doing here. Can you honestly say you've never seen this image before in your database? I shot a look at both Kansas Boy and Douche, who were both looking at me the way a chicken watches someone with an axe walking across the farmyard to the grindstone. I had seen a full blown up copy of that image colored in with highlighter on Kansas Boy's desk. So I said, yeah, you probably should take that down, that's not appropriate for a workplace environment, before getting a long drawn out broad explanation of where a stick was and why I should pull it out of my behind. He knew I knew where I had seen it before, and while I didn't know where Kansas Boy had gotten it from, I could make an educated guess. And they both knew I had zero inclination to even pretend to take a hit for them. The bus was rolling downhill, and while I wasn't throwing them under it like they tried to throw me, I sure as heck wasn't going to push them out of the way. My jaw worked a few more times before I said, yes, I can honestly say it does not exist in the engineering database, now or ever. I can show you what does exist in the history of created part numbers. I know for certain that part number does not exist. And with that, I pulled up the template database on my director's computer. We went through the full template database using every iteration of that particular part number until the VP was satisfied. Then she asked me, "And you and your team never saw this while you were doing all the printing this week?" I can speak to anyone else, but if we had seen it, we would have flagged it. We would have immediately brought it to the attention of the reviewer of the schematic, Kansas Boy, and the engineer whose name is on the drawing, Douche, to have it removed immediately. We can run a search in the full engineering database to see where this part number shows up on all drawings, so long as we make sure to search for all hidden part numbers. Douche said, "Oh no, that would take way too much time. We can't do that. We have to submit this by the end of the day today." Kansas Boy, in one of the speediest possible sentences I had ever heard come out of his mouth, said the exact same thing. The president, who had been glowering in the corner, said, "This project is on hold until we determine exactly how compromised these engineering drawings are. Every single drawing that this part shows up on must be resubmitted and reviewed by at least 3 people. One of whom is going to be the lead engineer who signed off on every one of these, and at least one senior manager of engineering who isn't involved. We aren't this kind of company." Douche and Kansas Boy actually went white at that, and both started looking at me with this pleading expression. The axe was sharpened to a razor's edge, and now it was down to whether the fried chicken or duck à la orange was on the menu. The president looked at me and said, "Run the search. I don't care how long it takes. I want a copy on the vice president's desk in print of every drawing with this part in our database, and one for everyone in this room, along with who created the drawing, who reviewed it, and who approved it." Now, I'm one of the only people in the company who had admin access to the engineering part database because I had created. I set an automated rule that forced everyone who used it to change their password once a month to a new 16 or more character string with symbols and numbers. I knew for a fact nobody who had access to it was in the office except me. So did my director, who did have access but kept forgetting the code and eventually told me to just take him off the list. Because, as he put it, I know just enough to be dangerous. I said, "Absolutely. It will probably take at least 6 hours. Do you want me to stay late to finish it?" The director looked at me after checking with the VP and president and said, "No, you and your team already clocked over 80 hours each this week dealing with this deadline. Take the weekend and get it to us by Monday afternoon." Now, Kansas Boy and Douche are looking like they need to get up, but they are being held back. So I grabbed a secured laptop from one of the IT guys that I use for maintaining the database and headed to the IT department's secure server room. I plugged it in to run overnight, logged into my account and started the compilation. I locked the screen with an authentication dongle, pulled it from the USB port, stuck it in my pocket, then headed home. About 10 minutes after I left, I began getting panicked phone calls from my work number on my mobile. Then I began getting email notifications. Since the director had my number and he would just call me from his mobile and would give it to the VP and president if they needed it, I knew it was Kansas Boy and Douche. So I ignored it, because screw them. The next day I went golfing with my director as part of a charity golf event he had been working on, and as it turned out, the president and his wife, who all agreed that my golfing was utterly terrible and laughably so. They kept me around for the rest of the evening for dinner and a charity auction and got me drunk enough that they called me a cab and had a valet from the club drive my car home from me. Sunday I spent recuperating. Monday morning I went into the office, opened up the IT server room and found the laptop I had left plugged in missing. After checking with the IT crew, they let me know that Kansas Boy had insisted on Saturday morning that he needed to get the laptop to provide a critical list to the president by the end of the day. By Saturday afternoon, he had browbeaten the helpdesk guy, making barely $15 an hour, into letting him in to check on it, but after an hour said he was done and left. When I went by Douche's desk on my way to the director's office, right after I found out about the laptop incident, he and Kansas Boy were talking at his desk. Kansas gave me a huge smirk and then laughed. Douche still looked worried, but less so. When I walked out of my director's 5-minute closed-door session, my director said, "You know, you didn't have to make print copies, and you didn't have to come on Saturday morning to do it. You could have just sent us a PDF file." "Yeah, but you know, Kansas Boy and Douche like their print copies," and I walked over to hand 2 thick watches of printed database info to both Kansas and Douche. Looking right at them I said, "Besides, I was up early on Saturday anyway for the golf tournament, and I had to give the president his laser printer back. might as well make some last copies before it all goes back to normal. When I dropped off the list, I said, yeah, I gave everyone else their copies Saturday morning. On that list was every single engineering drawing from Douche's team. Douche had put his name on every single piece of paper his team had produced as either the originating engineer or the approving engineer. Kansas Boy was the reviewer on record. Over 40,000 engineering drawings, last and present, had their Maple Leaf part in them. From the project itself, there were nearly 150,000 pages of documentation referencing those drawings and using the line vector art from those files. By noon, both Douche and Kansas Boy's desks were completely empty. Douche had been fired and frog-marched from the building. Kansas Boy saw the writing on the wall and managed to submit his letter of resignation right before HR finished the paperwork. I left that company a few years later, and I'd like to say they never worked in aerospace again. But the reality is that both were working for a major airplane manufacturer within months of the story. And that's why I quit working in aerospace. The last story is called Don't Do Anything Outside Your Work Description. I started my first full-time office job at a corporate America hellhole a week after college. It was an industry I hadn't worked in before and I needed to be licensed. The company that hired me, we'll call them Smith Inc., paid for my licensing fees, study materials, classes, etc. for me to become licensed. The total cost was about $500. It was a sweet deal. They gave me approximately 90 days paid to study a textbook and pass an online course. I didn't have to do any work for the company, simply study and pass the licensing exam. It was pretty easy and I passed it on my first try. My boss, let's call her Mary, was super excited that I passed and I began training under an associate level coworker who had just been promoted from the position I was in. The coworker, Jen, was super great and helpful. She began training me on 2 simple tasks that I could do. The only rule was, if the client had a question specifically about the contract, I would ask Jen or forward it to my team lead. Well, I ended up getting an email from a client about the contract and I video called Jen to ask how to handle it. She walked me through it as I shared my screen with her. I wrote the email back to the client exactly how she told me and she read the email before sending it. A month goes by and everything is great. I'm learning and getting more comfortable. Then I get a really nasty email from Mary. She CC'd my whole team into the email, going on and on about how I cannot answer contract questions and how she has gone over this with me before. She hadn't. Jen was the one who told me I can't answer contract questions. Both Jen and I tried to explain what happened and that Jen was the one who wrote the email. I just typed what Jen said and sent it from my email since the client emailed me and not Jen. Mary then calls the team in a video call and goes on about how I don't know anything and I just started and I really don't know how this industry works and that answering contract questions is out of my job description. It went on for about 5 minutes. I say okay and get off the call crying. The next day, out of pure pettiness, I simply do the absolute bare minimum. I don't know anything, right Mary? I still complete all my tasks and everything that's required of me. Anything more advanced that I would normally try to learn with Jen's help? Nope. I just forwarded it to our team lead and said, sorry, Mary said I can't do anything outside my job description. Work was much less stressful after I decided to listen to Mary and what many others told me before. Don't do anything outside of your job description. Mary later fired me for being a whistleblower when I reported the company to the health authority for violating protocols. I sleep better at night knowing how much money Mary wasted on training me. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the like button. It really helps in the algorithm. Have a great day. Stay safe. Bye bye.